Good afternoon, everybody. For some of you, probably good morning. My name is Bill Dempster from 360 Public Affairs, and I am the Director of Educational Events for the Canadian Association for Healthcare Reimbursement. Special thanks to CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, to Health Canada, and to Don Hussereau, who are going to be taking part in today's webinar. But especially for advertising and spreading the word about this webinar and encouraging people to come out at some of their recent information sessions and on social media. And to all of our participants, we've got, of course, it would be a record number of participants for a CAHR webinar because this is the first CAHR webinar ever. But as some of you know, I'm a regular moderator or organizer of webinars, and this is a really stellar turnout in terms of participants and delegates. We've got the better part of 150 people who have registered. I can see 48 or 49 have actually logged in already, so we'll see how many people we get, but just a special thanks for being so interested and keen as this was coming together and now participating today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I would ask the people on the line to either use the questions box at the bottom right of your GoToWebinar panel or the comments or the chat box to kindly show or let me know what you can see when we start sharing screens here, because we want to make sure that you are able to see and share the right screen. So please bear with us as we put this up. And thank you. I believe somebody already tagged in on something. This is a problem with the chat. The presenter is showing the screen currently. So if I think that would be Nancy. Nancy, if you or somebody else on the line wouldn't mind just typing in and letting us know that things are somewhat in hand in terms of what we're showing and which screen you can see, that would be terrific and much appreciated. So today's webinar, we're going to explore Canada's early scientific advice programs and initiatives, taking a global and Canadian context to begin with. We're going to hear from, as I said, CADTH and Health Canada, and we're going to leave time at the end for some discussion and Q's and A's, and encourage you all to thanks again, Nancy. We are looking at beautiful screen of kids skiing. Let's try that again. Those are my kids. I am not supposed to show them, but let's try my screen. And if I have to, let's try main screen. Thank you, Nancy. Appreciate that. Oh, everyone likes to hear that their kids are beautiful to somebody. Okay. So Nancy, please, and this is the problem, switch on the screen again. We might have to keep this in slide view. Sorry, Don?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter? Or swap displays. That's what I'll do. Hopefully this should work now. So Nancy, feel free to tag back in and let us know what you can see. Okay, there we go. So today's participants, we have Don Hussereau, a health policy and technology assessment consultant, and previous executive or senior leader at CADTH as well. Amy Sood is here from CADTH, a scientific advisor and lead of the scientific advice program. We've got Lindsay Blaney, senior advisor to the Director General of the Biologics and Genetic Therapies Directorate at Health Canada in the Health Products and Food branch. And she is joined by Michelle Rémillard, senior policy analyst, also works at BGTD at Health Canada. And once again, I'm just going to direct traffic here, but hopefully we're going to, you're still seeing the kids skiing. Thank you. We're going to work on that right now and actually, yeah, now I have, there we go. Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Swap displays. Are you still seeing kids skiing? Still enjoying the kids skiing. And thank you, Aline and Nancy, for tagging in. Looking forward for some confirmation that you can actually see a decent screen that doesn't involve kids skiing. And our apologies. Did I mention that this is the first webinar that CAHR has? has done. Yes. Okay, so we've got yes, Daria. I'm going to assume that means yes. We are now live, and you can actually see the screen that we should be seeing, and that is the participants today. Okay, so what we'll discuss. No, still seeing kids. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Well, we're going to actually take this off of the screen that I'm sharing with everybody. We're going to use my laptop and simply broadcast from here and make sure that the sharing is of my screen. And if I have to go, yeah, there we go. Still seeing lovely kids. All right. Thank you so much for everyone's patience on this one. So I'm going to sharing, show Microsoft PowerPoint. Here we go. That should work now. So we're going to first review the global and Canadian contexts, and that will be Dawn. Please confirm with me, everybody, that Iman and everybody, that we're good to go in terms of what you can see. We're going to have a close-up overview of how the processes are working to date, how to engage with Health Canada and CADTH to ensure that these programs are meeting the needs of manufacturers and health systems, and we're going to have some time for panelist perspectives and discussion and Q's and A's. We have no car slides yet. No, still kids. I'm so sorry, Martin and everybody. This is really bizarre. We should be showing, I'm going to stop showing screen and start again. Probably it. And now show. So as a good radio announcer, I should keep on talking as I'm handling the technical difficulties, and looking forward to a lot of trouble at home when I've been showing pictures of my family for this long. We're going to talk about some Q's and A's, and we've actually put up some scenes as well for folks to have and to prompt you to. Excellent work. Thank you. So we should be good to go if I actually start, because we have one animation. Discussion and Q's and A's. Okay, good. So, Dawn, I will pass it over to you to kick us off and give us a few of your and international perspectives. Dawn will be followed by Amy Sood of CADTH, and then Health Canada will tag in, and I'll help lead some of the Q's and A's at the end. Over to you, Dawn.
Have a peek at the tiny. That's fine. That's good. Okay. So I've been asked to just sort of set up some of the context around early scientific advice. I did do some work last year, which I'll discuss a little bit. But the question is, of course, why do we have early scientific advice programs? I think for a lot of people, this is probably fairly obvious. Unlike other markets where people can sort of quickly develop things and bring them to market and bring them to sell, pharmaceuticals is a little more complex than that. There is a lot of development that goes into products, and then a lot of processes to look at the value of something, including in Canada, the regulator, the HTA processes that support payers, and ultimately the payers and listing agreements through the PCPA to the point where something is both marketed and reimbursed. So the idea of the early scientific advice, of course, then is to give folks that are developing new products some notion of what might be considered valuable, at least to payers, or at least to the HTA bodies that support them in terms of the kinds of details that they might want to bring on. When talking to companies who've used scientific advice programs, and I did speak to a number of national companies as well as global companies. It's typically the idea is that using scientific advice is in the context of looking at something where they really are not sure how an HTA body or a payer is going to respond because there's no real precedence for the technology. There's nothing like it that's been reviewed. Sometimes companies also see it as potentially giving them a competitive advantage to maybe get some insights into the kinds of pieces of information that would be useful to HTA bodies or to confirm things that they think might be useful. It also gives them insights potentially into market access opportunities, also forges a relationship, obviously, and understanding of the bodies that ultimately they're going to have to submit information to. And the concept is really not a new one, at least in the world of technology assessment. In the early 90s, there was a lot of talk about a concept called constructive technology assessment. And the idea was that constructive technology assessment occurred well upstream. So then rather than somebody going through all the trouble of developing something, whether that be healthcare technology or some kind of alternative energy technology or whatever, and then at the very end of it be told that's not valuable, let's work together. Let's talk about what's actually needed. Let's talk about how we can do this. And so the idea of constructive technology assessment was actually a thing, and I think some of the lessons borrowed from this concept have been translated to the world of early scientific advice and dialogue. In the next slide, I just wanted to highlight some of the timing around these developments. We first saw these kinds of early scientific advice processes pop up not even 10 years ago. The UK, for example, had an early scientific advice process that they launched, as well did Sweden. And there were a number of HTA bodies in Europe that kind of followed suit, including work with the European Union network of HTA bodies as well. On top of that, there were also independent think tanks or academic initiatives like Tapestry and Green Park Collaborative that also attempted to bring together different actors, industry, HTA bodies, regulators, to talk about technologies that had yet to be developed and the kind of information that might be needed. In North America, we actually, on the non-drug side, saw kind of an early parallel review process initiated by the FDA, and then only a few years ago, CADTH did launch their early scientific advice program, and you'll hear Amy speak about that. When you look at all of these programs, you see there are different approaches that have been taken in terms of the scope of when advice is sought. Some programs simply look at or will provide advice prior to a phase 3 program being developed. Some are willing to provide advice further downstream of that. In terms of the content, typically HTA bodies are concerned with clinical and economic information, and that tends to be the core of the advice that's offered, but there is other advice that is given around things like patient values, etc. And that's why I think on some level, this is in some sense a kind of early policy advice, maybe than early scientific advice proper. It's not simply looking or talking about clinical information or clinical scientific information. In some cases, people are providing advice to simply in a written format. In other cases, there's actually a discussion or even a dialogue and different HTA bodies have taken different approaches. And then in terms of who is involved with the advice, what we do see is that there have been variations of a theme of this. Typically, it is a single company speaking to a single HTA body, but it could be one or more HTA bodies, as we saw with the European Union network. It could also be what's called tripartite advice, involving the regulator, the HTA body, and the company together to have a discussion. And that there are two models of that, where one, companies are asking the regulator if they can involve also the HTA body, and there are other models where folks are asking the HTA body if they can involve the regulator. And then with the academic initiatives, we see advice processes where more than one company is involved. But you can imagine then that also changes the dynamic. The nature of advice, some HTA bodies have taken an approach where advice is confidential, even not to be shared at the point of submitting ultimately to the HTA body. Others have provided binding advice or some ruling on an outcome which is expected then to be part of the submission. For companies that want to engage with these things, things that they do need to consider, most of these processes are charging usually on a cost recovery basis, some kind of fee, and often the fee will just depend on the scope of advice, the amount of advice that's given. And various bodies are providing advice in different timelines, and obviously, again, more advice, more time typically. So there are some giving quick advice at a low fee, and others will give a full package at a higher fee. Obviously, companies also have to consider the timing of these. They can, they do require meetings and scheduling, and the development often of a briefing book, which are questions that have been refined with the advisory body, and then with information attached to that, so that this kind of preliminary dossier, in a way, can be considered. I'm going to leave it there because I think the other speakers have more to say than I do. I did write something last year. You can go to this website, or you can just Google it. Not much has changed, although the European processes that are mentioned in this article have been updated, and there's been some news, but it'll give you a sense of what is there out there, and I'll leave it there.
And just a quick check for the listeners. I understand we might have been stuck on slide 3, and thank you, Julie, for confirming that. If I get out of here, and just what we might have to do, and unfortunately this might limit the small animation we have, we're simply going to share this screen and start at this CADTH slide here. Pass it over to Amy. For those of you who are on the line. Actually, all of you are on the line. Here's Don's contact information. Please get back in touch with him if you have any questions, and I'm sure we will at the end as well. So, Amy, over to you. Thank you, Don.
Thanks, Bill. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll be providing a brief overview of CADTH's Scientific Advice Program, and then I'll discuss some updates to our program, including our ongoing activities with Health Canada. So CADTH's Scientific Advice provides advice on early drug development plans from a Canadian health technology assessment perspective. The advice is non-binding, confidential, and delivered on a cost recovery basis. And we hope that all stakeholders can benefit from this process. From an industry perspective, this might reduce the uncertainty involved in drug development. From the perspective of participating drug plan payers, this might result in stronger recommendations based on more complete and relevant evidence. And finally, from the perspective of patients and clinicians, this might improve timely access to drugs. Since the program launched in 2015, we have completed 5 projects with 3 currently ongoing. And what we've appreciated is that we continue to have repeat applicants, which gives us some indication of the perceived value of our program. In the next slide, you'll see our standard timeline, and you'll see that we require 14 weeks from submission of the briefing book that Don briefly mentioned to the face-to-face scientific advice meeting, which is where CADTH's advice is presented. The scientific advice meeting is a 3-hour meeting that allows for a two-way dialogue between the pharmaceutical company representatives and CADTH staff, as well as the external experts that we engage in the process. The timeline between online application to the briefing book submission is 4 weeks, and the written record of scientific advice is provided 4 weeks after the face-to-face scientific advice meeting. And this written record includes advice that was presented at the meeting along with discussion points that occurred at the meeting. The current fees range from $65,000 to $100,000 Canadian, plus applicable taxes. And the fee is determined after we receive the briefing book and we assess the complexity of the project at that point. Factors that could influence the price include the number of questions that the sponsor asks, the number of indications that might be considered, and the number of trials that are being looked at, and other aspects that might impact the complexity of the project. For each project, we engage up to 3 external experts, including an academic leader in the field with clinical expertise, a previous member of one of CADTH's advisory committees that's responsible for providing reimbursement recommendations, and we also involve an expert health economist if appropriate. We also interview a patient with a condition and incorporate the patient's perspective into our record of scientific advice. A CADTH scientific advisor then drafts the advice with input from the experts and also consults with other relevant CADTH staff to ensure alignment with current CADTH drug review processes. The team participates in 3 preparatory meetings leading up to the face-to-face scientific advice meeting. Late last year, we had an external consultant conduct semi-structured interviews with various pharmaceutical companies, and this was done in order to understand how we could better meet the needs of our stakeholders. Participants that were interviewed included 16 companies, which consisted of 4 small companies, 6 large US-based companies, and 6 large internationally based companies. When participants were asked about opportunities for improvement with respect to our current program, the following key themes emerged. Many comments related to expanded scope, specifically the ability to obtain advice after initiation of phase 3 trials, and another theme related to increasing flexibility with respect to timelines. They also asked for flexibility in fees in terms of smaller fees for fewer questions, including a faster process for smaller projects was often mentioned. Many participants would also see value in having parallel or joint advice with regulatory and or other HTA agencies. And just a quick mention that if you are planning to attend ISPOR in Glasgow, Scotland next month, we will be presenting further information on the findings of these interviews. So in terms of scope of CADTH scientific advice program, we are currently still focusing on advice prior to initiation of phase 3 trials or pivotal trials. We are, however, expanding the scope to include earlier advice after initiation of earlier advice prior to initiation of phase 2 trials. And while our program is not set up to provide advice after initiation of phase 3 trials, CADTH might consider this possibility in the future. We are committed to making improvements to other aspects of our program, and we are listening to what our stakeholders have told us. So based on what we heard, we're offering increased flexibility. So this could involve customized timelines, more timely advice for smaller requests, and advice at multiple touch points along the early drug development plan, so prior to phase 3 and potentially prior to phase 2. So this slide illustrates what a smaller request could involve. On the left side, you see our current standard timeline, and on the right is an example of what a smaller request might involve. So it could involve a fewer number of questions, potentially 2 or 3 clinical questions, maybe just 1 clinical expert rather than our usual 3 experts, We would still have a patient interview to incorporate the patient's perspective, and potentially no face-to-face scientific advice meeting to deliver the advice. This would then be accompanied by a lower fee, and as well, we might be able to then provide a shorter time frame. So the time from the briefing book submission to the delivery of the written record of scientific advice might be 10 to 12 weeks rather than the 14 plus 4 weeks. So of course, this is just an illustrative option, and we are open to discussing the particular needs of the applicant. So last but not least, I'd like to provide an update on our activities with Health Canada. Since late 2016, CADTH has approached applicants to the Scientific Advice Program to explore interest and request consent to have Health Canada representatives observe our process. The purpose of this collaboration is for us to learn about each other's perspectives and lay some of the groundwork for future parallel regulatory HTA advice. To date, all 4 applicants that we have approached have provided consent to Health Canada's participation in our process in an observatory role. In December, Health Canada observed a face-to-face scientific advice meeting. And this year, we've increased Health Canada's participation to include attendance at our preparatory team meetings, in addition to observing at the face-to-face scientific advice meeting. In addition, for one of these files, CADTH is observing the corresponding preclinical trial application meeting at Health Canada. So in terms of the future, what we've learned so far with our collaboration with Health Canada, it's been a great learning experience on both sides. And while there are some different perspectives based on our mandates, we do have a lot of similarities. Development of a parallel regulatory HTA process for early scientific advice in Canada may provide an opportunity to clarify divergent advice and may have the potential to improve timely access to new drugs for Canadians. So with respect to next steps, CADTH will be participating in the early parallel scientific advice project that is being led by Health Canada, and our next speaker, Lindsay Blaney, will also discuss that in more detail.
Thank you, Amy. So I'm Lindsay Blaney, and I'm with Health Canada. And today I'm going to talk about what we do in Canada in terms of early scientific advice, what is being done internationally. I will briefly introduce the R2D2 initiative. Then I will tell you more about the early parallel scientific advice project that Amy just alluded to, what it is, where we want to go with it, where we're at, and next steps. And we also thought we should use this opportunity today to talk to you about healthcare system needs, a concept that will likely impact a number of initiatives at Health Canada. And I have my colleague here with me, Michelle Rémillard, who will briefly describe this concept and provide you with her coordinates so you can provide input. The intent is not to have a discussion about this concept today, but to make sure that you're aware of that discussion and know how to provide feedback. So at Health Canada at the moment, we do not provide early scientific advice per se. However, we do activities where advice is provided prior to submission filing. We have 2 activities where we do that: pre-clinical trial application meetings and pre-submission meetings. So at pre-clinical trial application meetings, the timing for the clinical trial applications is anytime prior to clinical trials, so it could be pre-phase 1, pre-phase 2, or pre-phase 3, but usually we get those pre-phase 1 or pre-phase 2. We only do those for clinical trials conducted in Canada, and at those meetings, data requirements are discussed, and also issues regarding the drug development plan. For pre-submission meetings, the objective is to ensure completeness of the submission and also optimal presentation and organization of the submission to support an efficient review. It's not to discuss evidence requirements because at this point it's too late. Phase 3 clinical trials are likely underway or nearing completion or completed, so it's not being discussed at this point. And usually those meetings occur just months prior to filing. CADTH as an established scientific advice process, as Amy just described to us, which was launched in January 2015. And INES, l'Institut National d'Excellence en Santé et en Services Sociaux, an HTA in Quebec. They do not provide this service at this point, but they are interested in exploring the possibility of doing early parallel scientific advice with us. Internationally, Don already alluded to some of the activities internationally, but I'm mostly going to focus on parallel scientific advice. The United States, they have a well-established scientific advice program, but in terms of parallel scientific advice provided with HTA, not so much, because they do not have bodies such HTA bodies in the US. They do provide joint advice with the EMA. EMA, by far, are the ones who have the most experience with parallel scientific advice with HTAs. They have done it since 2010. And as of July of this year, they have revamped their program and guidance. It's now called Parallel Consultations, with a single window approach through UNETA, a consortium of HTAs across Europe. In Australia, very limited experience with early parallel scientific advice. TGA, the regulator, and PBAC, the HTA, conducted 2 pilots on 2 different drugs back in 2009, but nothing has been done since then. They are considering conducting parallel scientific advice, but they're not doing it at this time. And I just want to mention that in Australia, the reviews of the regulator and the HTAs are aligned. And in the UK, MHRA, the regulator, and NICE, the HTA, they have information on the joint scientific advice program that they offer on their respective websites. But as of 2014, only 1 joint advice had been provided, and we don't have any information that additional ones have occurred after. So limited experience there as well. You may already have heard about the R2D2 initiative, which stands for Regulatory Review of Drugs and Devices, or R2D2. It's a priority initiative in the department. It has 15 projects under it. Each of the small boxes that you see on this slide is one project. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Early Parallel Scientific Advice Project, which is one of the red ones in the blue box on the left. And just so you know, the healthcare system needs concept that Michelle is going to talk to us about in a few moments is part of the other project in red in the orange box, expansion of priority review pathways. So the early parallel scientific advice fits within the continuum of interactions that we have with the sponsors prior to submission filing. The difference between I refer to it as EPSA, but it's shorter. So the difference between EPSA and pre-submission meeting is that it involves the HTA, and also it occurs early enough in the drug development process plan that we can discuss data requirements and influence the design of clinical trials. Early parallel scientific advice could take place pre-phase 1, pre-phase 2, or pre-phase 3. The arrow on the right represents the process whereby Health Canada would be providing early scientific advice on its own if need be. This process will result or should result in a unique drug development plan when possible, as opposed to multiple ones, one for the regulator, one for the HTA. The generation of more robust, higher quality, and more relevant evidence, and evidence that will satisfy the needs of both the HTA and the regulator. The scope of this project includes drugs, so pharmaceuticals and biologics. It excludes vaccines and medical devices. For medical devices, early advice is captured under another R2D2 project. It's expected that this project will take us from a situation where evidence does not adequately support regulatory authorization or HTA recommendation to a situation where the evidence is more robust, of better quality, and more relevant. where the likelihood of positive decision by the regulator and positive recommendations by the HTA are increased, and where we have more single drug development plans. It should also reduce the number of difficult, controversial decisions because of the lower quality and less relevant evidence, and provide for clearer, more solid decisions by both the regulator and the HTA. And it should also facilitate the alignment of the regulator and HTA reviews down the line, which is another R2D2 project. Early parallel scientific advice is an excellent opportunity to incorporate patient input into the review process, especially at an early stage. Patients are very knowledgeable about their disease and treatment, and they possess information that should inform both the regulatory and HTA assessments in terms of which outcomes should be measured in clinical trials. Involving patients also assists in increasing the transparency and openness of the decision-making process, as well as increasing the respect for the decision-making process. The intent is to build on work already underway in the department related to patient involvement and to capitalize on CADTH's existing patient input programs. CADTH has incorporated patient input into the Common Drug Review since 2010 and now gathers patient input even earlier in the drug development process as part of its scientific advice program. So we certainly want to build on that solid experience and expertise. Early parallel scientific advice also reduces uncertainties for industry. For example, the sponsor may have information earlier in the process to make a decision regarding whether or not to pursue with a particular product. It's also an opportunity to harmonize branch processes involving interactions with sponsors prior to drug filing, and I'm referring to early parallel scientific advice, but also preclinical trial application meetings and pre-submission meetings. All those meetings differ in their objectives, but they all aim at making the review more efficient, and they should be harmonized in terms of the process as much as possible. So in terms of where we're at and next steps, we are currently working on the development of an issue analysis summary, and that is the policy that will support the program. The resource team that we have to help us with that includes members from the pre-market directorates, the post-market directorate, and we also have representatives from CADTH and INIS. That will be followed by internal consultations, and I mean consultations within the department, within Health Canada. And then we will conduct external consultations with all of our stakeholders. So that would include industry, healthcare professionals, academia, provinces, territories, HTAs, patient groups, and of course the general public. A pilot will then be conducted. That will be followed by the issuance of a guidance document and the implementation of the process. So that's it for early parallel scientific advice, and I will now turn it over to my colleague Michelle for the portion of the presentation on healthcare system needs.
Okay. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And as Lindsay mentioned, even though this is my project, well, not part of the early parallel scientific advice work, we did want to highlight it today, bring it to the table, and let you know what is going on, because this falls under R2D2 as well, and it's called the expansion of priority review pathways. As Lindsay pointed out, it's noted on one of those earlier slides. And the work we do with this project could potentially influence other work under R2D2, and in particular the early parallel scientific advice. So we do want to, the focus of this work in this project is on this new concept for Health Canada, and that's healthcare system need. So we wanted to bring this to your attention today. So at Health Canada, we review a drug submission in order to assess the drug's safety, efficacy, and quality. Submissions are screened as they are filed by industry, and we really don't consider healthcare system need in the broader sense with this current process. However, we have a priority review policy, and this provides shorter review times for certain submissions, but it's quite limited. This pathway is only for those drugs that treat serious life-threatening conditions or diseases. So we know there's a gap. We know there are other healthcare system needs. So with this project, we're looking at developing pathways or expanding the current pathway we have that prioritize those drugs that address healthcare system needs in the broad sense. But before we can do that, we need to figure out what healthcare system need means. So we've got to come up with some type of formalized definition. So it's no easy task, as you can imagine. There are several key partners or health partners across the drug access chain in Canada, and each respecting their own priorities and ideas of what healthcare system means. So we're consulting with all of these healthcare partners, all of our stakeholders, very extensively on this concept. It's critical, and as we mentioned earlier, it will potentially inform some of our other work under R2D2. This slide is simply an example, list example. So keep in mind, please, it's very random, not all-inclusive. It's just a list of what could be considered criteria, things that we've heard in our discussions to date. So we're looking at things like this that we can formalize into some sort of definition around healthcare system need. You'll see there, you can group them in themes. We have unmet need, cost effectiveness, emergency use, and under unmet need we have serious or life-threatening conditions, so that's basically our priority review policy now. So where do we go with that? Can we expand that policy and introduce orphan drugs, drugs that can treat smaller populations, special populations? The list goes on, as I'm hoping everyone can see the slide. Some of the other ideas we've heard too that aren't on the slide are whether we should consider those drug alternatives when there are shortages, drugs for, I think I mentioned this already actually, small market, drugs for where there's no alternative, prescription to over-the-counter switches, and potentially drugs that could reduce the length of hospital stay or get patients back to work sooner. So quite a few under the theme of quality of life have been raised for us too. So again, this is just to get people thinking, wrap their heads and ideas around new criteria that we can be looking at. And I'm going to leave this with you here. If you have, I don't think we're really going to discuss this part of the work under R2D2 here today, but I really welcome your input. If you want to contact me directly, you can send your ideas to my email account. I'll take it all in as part of our formal consultative work. And yeah, if you have specific ideas that or criteria you think we should add to this list and thoroughly examine, or things on here that you want pulled off right away, we'll just we're open to your thoughts. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle, Lindsay, and Dawn and Amy for kicking off the webinar and walking through how the systems are working today in some global perspectives, as well as a bit of a sneak peek on where Health Canada has taken the concept of healthcare system needs. I'll reiterate that this isn't for discussion on this webinar. It could be the subject of a future webinar or an event or a panel at CAHR at the events coming up. But thank you, Michelle, for this opportunity right now to help get the healthcare reimbursement communities heads around some of those projects and specifically that issue, which we understand has been raised over the last year or so, and more specifically at the May 16th Health Minister's announcement earlier this summer in Ottawa. We've come up with a few themes from today's discussion and some Q's and A's. I would invite the delegates on the line to also share some of their thoughts and comments and questions. There is a question box for you to fill out on the bottom right of your GoToWebinar panel. So my first question would be, how successful have you been, or I should say, have the early scientific advice initiative been to date in actually influencing trial designs? Is there any way that you could, use that as a potential metric for success? And any thoughts on that in terms of how they've actually been received and changed behavior? I don't know, Don, do you want to start on that one?
I mean, there's all kinds of sort of stories of individual impacts. Obviously, though, there's a lot of considerations in terms of and a lot of advice given back to companies in terms of trial design, what have you. So it's always difficult to pinpoint one thing. I like to think, though, that, I mean, ultimately, I think we've seen clinical development programs change in response to HTA demands, and so, and we see that in certain therapeutic areas. COPD is a great example. So we, I would think that an early scientific advice process would just simply make that a little easier, rather than getting, as I said, to the end and finding out that maybe you should have done something differently. Yeah, so I think they've had an impact, but I think there's just sort of it's difficult to pinpoint, one story that, possibly Amy has more to say, or I'm not sure.
Sure. So from CADTH's perspective, we are very interested in the impact of our program, and after each project, we do ask our applicants to fill out a feedback survey just to determine, their experience and whether they thought that there is any room for improvement. And certainly we would be interested in, impact of whether they did incorporate any of our advice into our trials. And at this point, it's a bit early to say, because we've only started our program in 2015, and often these clinical trials take many years to complete, and then thereafter come back to us for a reimbursement decision. So at a certain point in the future, we would definitely be interested in looking back to see, how much of that advice was taken up. But at this point, it's too early to tell, because many of the applications that have come through haven't completed their studies, and we don't have the submissions at hand, which often take anywhere from 3 to 7 years. So we will be looking forward to that.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question, actually, and this might be, unless you want to tag in on influence of the early scientific advice to date.
Yes, just from Health Canada's perspective, as I said, we don't do early parallel scientific advice at this point, but what we do with preclinical trial applications is maybe what resembles the most what early parallel scientific advice could be, although in this case it's limited to clinical trials conducted in Canada. And I wouldn't be able to give you any specific examples, but I know from talking with the head of the clinical trial division that on the submission that they review for pre-phase 1 and pre-phase 2 mostly, they do influence the design of clinical trials, whether it's the size or the clinical outcomes that are going to be measured. It does have an influence, but as I said, it's limited to those clinical trials that are conducted in Canada. So by adding an early parallel scientific advice program, we could extend that to, it would be accessible to all submissions.
Okay, excellent. A question from one of the participants: when will the pilot for parallel scientific advice start, and will advice still be provided on economics through that parallel advice program? And maybe that's a question for both Lindsay and for Amy, for that matter.
So I'll start, Amy. So the pilot, at this point, we're planning to be able to start it in mid to late 2018. And in terms of what is it that we are going to be looking at, we have not discussed that in depth so far, but I suspect that it will be limited to the interest that we have in common, and that will be the clinical information.
And yes, I would agree with Lindsay. And we will still be offering our standard scientific advice process, which could include the clinical and economic questions, and that would still be running during this.
Excellent. There's a couple of the themes that we put up and something that jumped out at me from your slides in terms of the interest to date in inviting Health Canada to observe, and that's more of the applicants are bringing forward biologic drugs, and it seems that oncology is represented more than other therapeutic areas. Any concept as to why that's the case, and anything that the oncology community might need to know, or do you want to try to expand this potentially to other areas as well, or any or ideas about why oncology is specifically an area of interest for this from manufacturers?
I mean, I could offer a guess, which is, oncology is typically the canary in the coal mine in terms of technology, in terms of pressure, but there are a lot of very innovative things meeting unmet needs in oncology. So there are a lot of things that are coming in that have no precedence. I suspect, and so if you think about things like immune checkpoint inhibitors and what have you, new mechanisms of action, things that have just not been seen before, different lines of therapy, I suspect that probably has a lot to do with it. And also, frankly, it's a big opportunity, but there are risks in developing these things. So I think people want to make sure they get it right.
And I would agree with that. And also, I think with personalized medicine and more targeted therapies, there are a lot of questions around companion diagnostics and cutoff points and whatnot. So I think they do have more questions and more advancement in that area.
And Amy, on that, are you seeing some of the trial designs and packages coming forward in oncology utilize more adaptive clinical trials and earlier data to try to apply for access, and that might be a little bit more complicated than a standard chemical package? And that's just maybe my supposition or guess, having worked in this a little bit as well.
Yes, absolutely. So we have seen some questions around earlier phase 2 data and whether that would be sufficient for a reimbursement recommendation. And certainly, we are hearing more about adaptive study designs. We haven't seen any yet come through, but certainly that's a growing area, and I suspect that we'll get a lot of applications and interest in learning more about what the HTAs are expecting and now what the HTA and regulators would be expecting from those.
Excellent. We have another question from the participants, but before we get to that, and thank you, I'd encourage people to continue asking it. I wanted to ask about combination products that are coming forward. Do you think that, not combination products, but indications for which there are multiple manufacturers that would potentially find a line of therapy useful in combining those two technologies at the same time? Do you think that there's an opportunity for the early scientific advice to potentially provide either joint advice to both manufacturers or to deal with some of those issues coming forward? And don't feel obliged at all to answer that. That's more of maybe a future webinar question, but just something that we see if we're looking forward 3 or 4 years, especially in oncology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're open certainly to questions, that haven't been asked before, and I suspect, we just have to work out some issues of confidentiality, whether there'd be one applicant coming in to ask the questions, but certainly we're open to exploring any of those types of questions, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with Amy. Certainly, if it's something that is happening, that is in a reality, I think we need to certainly address it in our issue analysis summary, in our policy. Maybe we would like to get some practice before with single manufacturers, but down the line, if it is a need that is there, we would certainly have to consider it and look into it.
Excellent. So a good question from a participant. Why is there a different process for devices, and why are vaccines not included? And perhaps the follow-on question to that would be, is the other process for devices potentially, are you learning from that? Or is there any consideration about how the two could be brought together potentially? Or anything you could give us in terms of medical devices and vaccines?
Yeah, those are very good questions. For vaccines, my understanding is that the clinical data is more straightforward, and so the benefits from an early scientific advice program would not be as great as it would be for biologics or pharmaceuticals. So that's my understanding. I could be wrong on that. For medical devices, the way medical devices are developed in terms of they have investigational testing applications rather than clinical trials, it's a bit different. So right now it's on a different course. At this time, the medical devices program, they're not as advanced as the drugs program in terms of pre-submission meetings, for example. They don't have that yet. So they're kind of catching up on that, and so eventually they will have an early parallel scientific advice for medical devices, but they're not at the same stage where we're at. When they have developed their program further, we will probably be able to look at synergies and how we can harmonize our two programs. But at this point, it's better that they be developed independently.
Thanks. We've got a question going global, actually, and several of you mentioned that Europe is really a forerunner on these programs. Have you had any thoughts on having joint HTA and regulatory early scientific advice programs working with or partnering with other agencies in Europe or elsewhere for that matter?
That is also an excellent question. So I don't think you remember my slide on opportunities. I mentioned 3, but that's the 4th opportunity, and yes, we will be looking into it. We want to have a solid process that we want to be able to run on our own. We want to be able to provide early scientific advice on our own as a regulator with our HTAs, CADTH, and INIS, but also we want to look into establishing an agreement with the EMA and do it with them. We already have a confidentiality agreement with them, so it's something that's part of the project scope.
And Amy, I know Brian spends a lot of time in Europe and elsewhere, and actually, for that matter, you've got people almost seconded into UNETA. So a lot of work and is being done and to get to know what's happening over there. Any news in terms of how CADTH is potentially participating or taking that a step further, as we were just talking about?
Well, certainly we're currently really focusing on expanding our CADTH scientific advice program and doing some work with Health Canada. And so we're mainly focusing on that now, and I can't say that we won't look outside in the future, but our main focus is to develop our program.
Okay. In Canada. We talked about phase 3 and phase 2 in terms of the cutoff points. One question I had was more once products are on market or once they get out there, is there any thought about supporting post-marketing data development, or are you providing advice on real-world evidence generation to support in the post-market world? Is that part of the package as well?
It is. In fact, it's very preliminary at this point, but when we look at the team that would be present during those face-to-face meetings with the manufacturer providing early parallel scientific advice, we would have representatives from the relevant scientific bureaus in the department, representatives from our HTAs, CADTH, or INIS, but we would also have representatives from our post-market directorate, MHPD. So we would have a reviewer from the relevant office from MHPD, as well as someone from their OPIDA office, so that's the Office of Pharmacoepidemiology and Data Analytics, to be able to get input into whatever we need to plan for in the future post-market, post-authorization. So post-authorization. So in terms of whether a risk management plan would be needed, or whether we can start thinking about what kind of real-world data we're going to be able to leverage on. So it's part of the project. We don't know exactly how it will work at this point, but certainly yes, it is being considered.
And certainly when I went out and spoke to people about the CADTH program and the features, there was a lot of folks that responded and said, and had interest in real-world data and advice on that. Obviously, there's a lot of resources that have been put into thinking about how to better use real-world data. So it's certainly something that people have asked about.
So I think we have time for one more question, and we're going from, you know, like phase 4 RWE and in-market and the market health products director involvement as well, right to the beginning. A good question: does early parallel scientific advice, or I should say now early scientific advice, include reviewing preclinical in vivo animal and mechanistic studies? How early can you start on this? And this is a thank you for the scientist on the line who's asking this question. And any thoughts from the panel?
From CADTH's perspective, we will just be focusing on the clinical pre-phase 2 and as early as pre-phase 2 and phase 3 studies. So not the molecular level.
Excellent.
For Health Canada, the scope includes pre-phase 1, pre-phase 2, and pre-phase 3. So if what you mentioned was part of pre-phase 1, it would be included, yes.
Excellent. So I'm just recognizing or acknowledging that it's just past 1 o'clock. One observation from somebody on the line is I think a good way to end it, actually, and not maybe put it out to a question, that there's a bit of a standard going forward for or being developed for scientific advice. And what's included, and that this is, you're learning from each other in terms of best practices, and looking globally for some ideas on what to do. And special thanks actually to Michel Régnard as well from Health Canada for bringing forward another project that's underway as part of the R2D2 suite of projects that Health Canada is undertaking. So that's an idea for potentially a future webinar or other CAHR events. So thank you. Any other final thoughts from the panel before we close and invite participants to log off? And before we do that, my apologies for any issues with the slide deck. An idea I thought about is potentially reshooting this and aligning the slides as they move forward with the discussion, so that people can watch it offline in the way that it should be watched, and you won't have to see a picture of my kids for the first 10 minutes. So thank you, and my apologies for that. Any final thoughts from the panel before we close it out?
I thought what you said really summarized it well, that we really learn from each other and look at what the best practices are around the world, so that we can develop something that meets our realities and the reality of the industry and the patients and the health practitioners of all of our stakeholders and the general public, of course.
Thank you so much. Well, on behalf of the Canadian Association for Healthcare Reimbursement, please bring forward some of your thoughts, but thank you to the panel for contributing today and taking the time out of your busy schedules to walk us through this and to participate in some of the questions. This is CAHR's first webinar that we've held. Hopefully there will be future ones in 2018. This one has been free of charge. In the future we might be putting up a fee, a reasonable fee for participants. So I hope that you found value in this one, so that can support your participation going forward. A little bit about CAHR briefly. It's a not-for-profit organization, volunteer board of directors. So this would mainly be about cost recovery, and hopefully that will not be a barrier to you to coming out to future events. Quick mention that CAHR is hosting National Day and its annual general meeting here in Ottawa on November 29th at the Marriott Hotel. It will be moderated by Maclean's Magazine's Paul Wells. He came back after a few years to agree to do this again this year. There will be payers, health technology assessment organizations, and professionals, as well as policy leaders, talking about the AAA, as some people call it, accessibility, affordability, and appropriate use of prescription drugs, taking a global and Canadian perspective on that. And Paul will, we hope, again, be leading a bit of a political pundits panel. So what you get to see on TV sometimes, hopefully you get to see live later in November. So again, special thanks to Don Hussereau, Amy Sood, Lindsay Blaney, and Michel Remillard for taking part today, and of course to every participant who logged in. Wishing you all the best, and hopefully see you soon on another webinar or at a CAHR event. Thanks very much.
Thank you, William.